Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. You're here for Policy Consequences for Occupation. We're just going to give about 30 seconds for people to continue to log on. It's great to see so many people here. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you all for being here. This is J Street U's JStream webinar. We are the Consequences Working Group, and we're going to be talking today about policy consequences for occupation. Before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself and the rest of the team. My name is Jonah. I am a junior at the University of Miami in Florida, and I'm a regional co-chair of J Street U for the Southeast and a member of the Consequences team. And I'll pass it to Tala, who is another one of our members, to introduce herself.
Yes, thank you, Jonah. It's good to be here with everybody today. My name is Tala. I'm a senior at UCLA. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve on the J Street National Board as a rep to the Southwest region of J Street U. And I'm going to pass it to Zach.
Hi, everybody. My name is Zach. My pronouns are he, him. I go to Brown University, and I'm a regional co-chair for the Northeast. Really excited to be here. I'll pass it to Kim.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim. I'm a senior at Johns Hopkins University, where I am one of the co-chairs of the J Street U chapter, and I'm also one of the regional co-chairs of J Street U's Southeast region. And I'll pass it to Maya.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maya. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a junior at Oberlin College and the co-chair of the chapter there. And I'll pass it to Casey.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a senior at Brandeis, and I'm one of the regional co-chairs for the Northeast region of J Street U, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I will pass it back to Jonah to get us started.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. I wanted to give a quick thank you to our behind the scenes tech people, Nate and Michael and Noah. And as Nate just put in the chat, we are going to have a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom. We will be looking through those as the presentation is going on. And at the conclusion of the presentation, which should be in about half an hour, we will get to questions. For being here, and I think we'll get started. So we can go to the next slide. Here we go. And we're just going to start with some opening framing. Can we go back one slide? Thanks for bearing with us. We are, as mentioned, J Street U students from 6 different schools: Brandeis, University of Miami, Oberlin, UCLA, Brown, and Johns Hopkins. Appears we lost the slide again, but I know what I have to say, so I'll do that. And we came together because we were all concerned about deepening occupation and about the fact that the peace process in Israel-Palestine is currently pretty distant. And we thought, how can we be improving the lives of Palestinians on the ground in the immediate term? If instead of shooting for a 2-state solution, what can we be doing just in the interim? And what we came to, and the team expanded over time and we started researching, was policy consequences. Things outside of the peace process that can be imposed on Israel for occupation and hopefully improve the lives of Palestinians on the ground. We did research about this over several months. We had a chance to talk to J Street staff, and we had panelists of experts from around the anti-occupation movement. And then we made a presentation at J Street U's Winter Leadership Institute. And since then, several of our chapters in the movement have actually put on events talking about policy consequences. And we think it's become a big part of what we talk about in J Street U, and we want it to become a big part of what J Street as a whole is talking about. And that's why we're here today. So a little bit more about this. Why does all of this matter? Why did we choose consequences? I think I hit on some of this already, but again, the peace process is distant. J Street's board views policy consequences as something outside of the framework of the peace process that can be used to make immediate change on the ground that might not end the occupation outright, but can prevent it and slow its exacerbation. Another reason is Joe Biden is the president. This is a big theme of ours. We we have power now as progressives. Even though the Trump administration had many disastrous policy moves on Israel-Palestine, the Biden team has already made some important reversals on that, restoring funding to UNRWA for Palestinians. They can also be pushed and advocated for to adopt policy consequences, which would be something that we think would have an even greater effect. And a third reason why this matters is our movement DNA. As I was mentioning earlier, one of our goals is to make consequences a major part of J Street's agenda. And just as J Street U members are really good at talking about the two-state solution and the occupation and things like that, one of the things that we've gotten better at as we've studied consequences is talking about consequences. And that's a big part of our movement DNA. And it's one of our goals to make that part of J Street's movement DNA as well, which is one of the reasons that we're having this presentation. And to talk a little bit more about what these consequences might actually look like, specifically in the realm of military aid, I'm going to pass it to Zach.
Thanks so much, Jonah. Right, so when we vision about what effective, real political consequences could look like, on Israel, but also just in general, that conversation has to start with the question of where is the current power, right? What does American policy towards Israel look like right now? And how does this policy, either implicitly or explicitly, greenlight continued occupation and continued infringement upon fundamental rights of Palestinians? Because of that, this conversation really has to start with a conversation about aid, right? Because the $3.8 billion virtually blank check that the American government gives to Israel annually is the most obvious expression of active American support for Israeli actions. So before going into what imposing consequences could look like, I'm going to give a brief background on what American aid policy towards Israel looks like right now and how it will be changing in the coming years. Next slide. Perfect. So the current aid policy is outlined under the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding, which was drafted by the Obama administration. So this is not actually a legally binding document, but it does allocate the funds that are appropriated annually by Congress and covers the next decade or so from fiscal year 2019 to 2028. Over the course of these 10 years, the MOU promises $38 billion to Israel. So that's $3.8 billion annually, 500 million of which goes to supporting missile defense systems, and 3.3 billion of which is in foreign military financing, or FMF. Which I will talk about more in a second. But before that, one important thing to note that is unique about this aid policy relative to our aid policies with other countries is that we allow Israel to use what is called cash flow financing and early transfer. So this means that Israel can use aid that we have promised them, but they haven't actually yet received. So they can do that to make purchases that are of higher value than what the sum of money that we give them in just one fiscal year. It's basically like handing them a credit card rather than a debit card, which makes our aid more powerful and more useful for them. Next slide. Yes, so as I said before, our aid to Israel falls into these two categories, right? FMF, foreign military financing, and missile defense. First, foreign military financing, the way that works is basically that of this $3.3 billion in annual FMF, Israel must use most of it, I think it's around 75% right now, to purchase American-made products and weapons. So because of this, our aid is not solely an expression of political support for Israel, but also a mutually beneficial investment in the American economy. So the remaining $500 million goes to production and research support for missile defense systems, such as the Iron Dome or Arrow. A little more straightforward. Next slide. So what is unique? What is new about this MOU in particular? One, it is a ton of money, right? Like $38 billion, that's a lot. It is the largest sum of foreign aid that the US not only has promised to Israel in the history of those, that relationship, but also promised to any country ever in American history. Specifically, the $33 billion in FMF, again, over 10 years, makes up 59% of total promised FMF worldwide. And it also represents about 20% of the Israeli military budget. So obviously this has the potential to be an insanely powerful political tool. But again, we'll discuss that a little bit more in a moment. Another very important thing to note about this MOU and what's different about it is that it phases out what is called offshore procurement. So as I said before, approximately 75% of current FMF has to be basically reinvested in the American economy, right, through purchase of American goods. But as of right now, the remaining 25% can be invested in the Israeli private sector and used in production of Israeli military grade weapons. Over the course of the next few years, however, this offshore procurement will be phased out from where it is right now, 25%, all the way down to 0%, as you can kind of see in that graph on the right. That means that the next few years are a particularly crucial period to think critically about aid policy, as all these enormous changes are taking place. So that's kind of a brief background on our current policy. And now I'm going to pass it off to Casey to talk about how this all relates to our conversation about consequences.
Great, thanks, Zach. That was great giving us all the background information. So as Zach told us, the U.S. gives billions of dollars in aid to Israel. So this is a place that we really have the opportunity to change the status quo and show an anti-occupation message. So if you can go to the next slide. So I'm just going to introduce a couple of consequences related to aid. So there's two types of consequences that we talked about in our working group. One is restrictive aid or aid use restrictions. This means that when we pledge aid to Israel, basically we say you can't use it for these things, such as like demolitions or anything related to upholding the occupation. And then we have conditional aid, which is the same sentiment saying don't use this money for these things. But if the money does get used for that, then the aid is taken away. So that's the difference between the two of them. And then I'm going to pass it to Tala to talk a little bit more about some examples.
All right. Thank you, Casey. So when we think about the two ways in which we can, play with the aid that we give to Israel to sort of get the political outcomes that we want, it's important to put it into context of the American political system. So what is the support or lack thereof for these particular policy measures? So let's first look at conditional aid. This is something that J Street does not endorse. It's something that when you look at the Democratic Party has very little support, especially amongst mainstream Democrats. It mostly gains support amongst progressive Democrats, right? So in July, for example, last year, July of 2020, when there was a threat of annexation by the Israeli government, there were a couple of responses to this threat. And one was a letter in the House that was written by AOC. This letter essentially was calling for aid conditionality. And while it was a well-written letter, it only really got 13 House signatories and one supporter in the Senate, Senator Bernie Sanders, right? And on the flip side, though, when you look at restrictive aid, when you look at aid use restrictions, in the same time period in July when there was this threat of annexation, there were a couple of responses that called for aid use restrictions. There was a Van Hollen amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act, and there was a letter by Reps Hannah Ishu and Cohen, essentially calling for restrictive aid both in the House and the Senate. And the Hannah Ishu Cohen letter got 64 signatories, and the Senate Van Hollen amendment got 19 Senate members to sign on. So that's clearly, you can see there's more currency behind aid use restrictions because of the current place of our American politics on Israel and on military aid to Israel. Another sort of tidbit to understand sort of where the Democratic Party stands is in 2020, when there were elections for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, all three representatives who are running for that position came out in support and endorsement of restrictive aid, not conditional aid, however. So it's important to put into context sort of how these different sort of policy consequences play out in the American political system. Right. So next slide, please. So now that we've spoken a bit about the differences in the way that we can use aid to impose consequences on Israel, it's important to also couch this in history, right? And I'm sure that if you're in an in-district meeting and you're speaking about aid use restrictions, the member of Congress or their staff member is going to ask you, well, when has aid use restrictions ever been implemented? And so we want to give a couple of examples that allow us to explore these options more realistically. So next slide, please. So we're going to look at two examples together today. The first is from 1977. This was when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States and Menachem Begin was prime minister of Israel. So during this time, Jimmy Carter essentially warned the Israeli government. He warned Menachem Begin that, please do not violate the Arms Export Control Act. The Arms Export Control Act is an act that banned the use of US arms for anything but defensive purposes. Despite this, though, when Israel invaded Lebanon during that time, Menachem Begin and the Israeli army ended up using US arms for offensive purposes. So essentially they broke the Arms Export Control Act. And so the US sort of catches wind of this, but Israel says, oh, no, the US arms have been withdrawn from the invasion. We're no longer using them. However, US intel finds out that this is not in fact true. So Carter doesn't actually do anything to the aid. He just threatens to take away the military aid in a letter to Menachem Begin that was later made public. As a result, Begin backs down and Israel leaves Lebanon. So that's the first example. The second one is a little bit more recent. This happened during the Bush Senior administration. So at the time, the Prime Minister of Israel was Yitzhak Shamir, and Bush Senior essentially threatened Israel's loan guarantees to drive forward the peace process. What happened in more detail is, in fact, one of the most controversial things that happened during the Bush administration. And so it was a time in which the US promised $10 billion in loan guarantees to help Soviet Jews resettle in Israel. But in September of 1991, Bush said that the United States would not be giving those guarantees to Israel until Yitzhak Shamir agreed to the specific demands he had. And the specific demands were to stop settlement construction in the West Bank and Gaza and to resume peace negotiations with the Palestinian. And as a result of this pressure, which essentially did not change any of the aid that we gave Israel, but as a result of this pressure, we get what we know now as the Madrid Peace Conference. And so it's important to look at these sort of aid-related consequences in the lens of history, to think about outside of the box of what is possible in the 21st century with regards to the deepening occupation. So now I'm going to pass it over to Kim, who's going to tell us a little bit about non-aid related consequences. Go ahead, Kim.
Great, thank you, Tala. So as we've seen from Tala and other presenters, the issue of aid is still relatively contentious at the federal political level. There's a lack of consensus about whether it's appropriate to restrict or condition aid in any way and what's the best path forward with respect to aid. So as students who are researching possibilities for political consequences, it was important for us to look beyond aid as well and investigate other ways in which we might impose consequences on the Israeli government for continuing occupation and other activities that are in violation of international norms and human rights laws. And so two main categories that we investigated along these lines of non-aid related consequences are the category of differentiation and the category of diplomatic consequences. And the following slides will go through each of those in a little bit more depth. Next slide, please. So the first of these buckets is sort of an array of diplomatic consequences that the United States might impose upon the Israeli government, a category that we have been calling revoking the diplomatic blank check. This, generally speaking, means the United States no longer providing a blanket defense for Israel's conduct in the occupation. This might apply in international organizations like the UN. It might apply in bilateral or multilateral diplomacy between the United States, the Israeli government, and potentially other countries or entities. And it might also apply in United States domestic law. A prominent, relatively recent example of the United States taking steps to revoke Israel's diplomatic blank check occurred in December of 2016 at the very end of Obama's administration. Up until that point, there had been a long tradition of the United States as a member of the Security Council, when resolutions were brought by other members of the Security Council that condemned Israel's settlement activity or otherwise admonished Israel for activities that it conducted as part of the occupation, the United States would veto these resolutions in the Security Council. And often they would still pass, but the United States would consistently veto them as a way to demonstrate that the United States was not willing to use an organization like the UN to criticize Israel or to impose any kind of diplomatic pressure on Israel for its activities. This changed in December of 2016 when the Obama administration and its representatives in the United Nations abstained from one such resolution criticizing Israeli settlement activity instead of vetoing it outright. It didn't actually change the political outcome. The resolution still passed along the usual lines, but this signaled a major shift in the willingness of the United States to utilize international bodies like the UN to impose diplomatic consequences on the activities of the Israeli government and revoking this diplomatic blank check. And so going forward, one way in which the United States might continue to impose pressure on the Israeli government to stop the occupation, stop the annexation, other actions that we at J Street agree are harmful, is to continue to use bodies like the UN, in addition to sort of these other international and national fora, to apply diplomatic pressure in ways that have not previously been applied. Next slide, please. The other general category of non-aid related consequences that we as a group investigated is the issue of differentiation. Broadly speaking, this means laws and regulations that distinguish between Israel and the occupied territories for legal, financial, or other purposes. Differentiation is already on the books in America and European law, including the EU in general and some European states more narrowly. But generally, these policies and their enforcement are very weak. One example of differentiation that has gotten a lot of news recently, especially at the end of the Trump administration, has been differentiation of settlement products, especially by labeling products as being made in Gaza, the West Bank, or Israel. And that's an example of differentiation because if one were to label products that were made in any three of these territories as being made from Israel, it would erase the distinction between Israel proper and territories that Israel has in the past or continues to control illegally through occupation and other means. So ensuring that these labels are applied correctly and meticulously to goods coming from Israel proper and the West Bank and Gaza ensures that the distinction between these territories is set in American law and financial practices, which paves the way for future negotiations for a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. One other category of differentiation that we on the consequences team think is a really ripe area for progress is differentiation in tax law. Specifically, a prominent example that has come out of our research is removing the tax exempt status that American organizations receive if they conduct particular kinds of activity in the settlements. Right now, nonprofit organizations based in the United States that contribute to operations both in Israel proper and in the occupied West Bank enjoy tax exempt status in the United States because of their nonprofit status. So an example of differentiation would be maintaining the tax exempt status for organizations doing business in Israel proper, but imposing additional taxes and removing this exemption status from organizations that support settlements directly or engage in other kinds of economic activity in the West Bank that make occupation more permanent and more viable in the long term. So now that we've gone through all this information about aid consequences, different kinds of non-aid consequences, I'm going to pass it over to Maya to do a little bit more synthesis about how we might use all this information going forward to guide our conversations and thinking about policy.
Thank you, Kim. So as you said, now that we have a basic understanding of differentiation, revoking the diplomatic blank check, and aid-related restrictions, we are going to take some time to talk about which consequences will bring the change we want to see in the US and in Israel. So next slide, please. So Peter Beinart's logic is that if we believe in the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we should be really honest about the fact that time is running out and we need to change the way that we think about and act on these issues. So this means that in order to salvage and jumpstart the two-state solution, we need to ensure that Palestinian land in the West Bank isn't being continuously annexed by Israel to build settlements. So it makes sense to start taking the idea of aid use restrictions more seriously. So this leads to two ideas on how to restrict aid. The first is the US refusing to fund specific actions. So for example, the detention of Palestinian children, demolition of Palestinian homes as a form of collective punishment, and blockading Gaza for specific things unrelated to terror, such as food exports or allowing Gazans to leave and study in universities in the West Bank. And the second idea is to threaten to reduce offshore procurements, which Zach explained are the parts of US military aid that Israel can use to stimulate its own economy and buy its own weaponry. So to clarify, the MOU outlines the phasing out of OSP, but this type of consequence refers to fast tracking that timeline as the MOU is not set in stone. So by threatening to reduce or completely cut this, the US can send a strong signal that expanding the occupation is no longer a viable option for Israel if it wants to continue receiving assistance from the US. Next slide, please. So in reality, no political consequence will ever go far enough, and it's important to acknowledge that and understand why. So we wanted to share a progressive critique of differentiation, which is outlined in a passage from Nathan Thrall's book, The Only Language They Understand. So I'm going to read it now. Differentiation acts not as a complement to punitive measures against Israel, but as an alternative to them. Differentiation creates an illusion of US castigation, but in reality, it insulates Israel from answering for its actions in the occupied territories by assuring that only settlements and not the government that creates them will suffer consequences for repeated violations of international law. So it's important that we critically question the efficacy of potential political actions like differentiation. They all have different symbolic, political, and financial consequences that carry a certain weight, but come at a different price. And it's complicated to strategize what's the best thing to do when, especially if your personal beliefs are ideologically uncompromising. So on the surface, differentiation seems like a more symbolic way to condemn settlements in the occupied territories with additional but not devastating financial effects. But in reality, it doesn't really hold Israel accountable for the illegal construction of settlements. So the question is, would campaigning for the political consequence of differentiation be worth the cost of its political capital? Does it move us closer to our goals? So there's a wide breadth of political theory and thought on issues of aid and not aid related consequences. And as always, this creates discourse and tension, which definitely exists within our J Street community. J Street Big supports the provision of security assistance outlined in the Memorandum of Understanding. However, they call for more aid transparency and believe the US should not foot the bill for annexation. Maybe you agree with J Street Big's take on this, maybe you don't. But either way, something has to be done, and we can't let the status quo continue on its current path. So to conclude, over the course of the last few months, we've learned a lot about the history and politics of political consequences and the role that they could play in our current reality. And I think that somewhat fittingly, our quest for understanding has left us with as many questions as answers. For example, in light of the current political environment, which consequences are worth the investment of our political capital? Or what are the greatest strengths and weaknesses of aid-related consequences? How realistic are they? We would like to leave you with some of these questions so we can think about these issues and work towards change together. So, all right, this marks the end of our presentation. Thank you all for staying with us until this point. Now we would like to open things up and transition into a Q&A to continue this conversation.
Great. Yeah, so we have a couple questions in the Q&A to start us off, but please keep adding questions so we can have a proper discussion. So the first question we got is, what actions should the Palestinians take to help facilitate positive change? Where does all of this leave Israel and Palestinians, the US and Gaza? So this is a really broad question. Yeah, does anyone want to jump in? Just maybe addressing the idea of like where Palestinians fall into this?
Yeah, I can take that question. First, I'm gonna assume that here we're talking about Palestinians in Palestine and Palestinian governmental organizations, and not, necessarily American Palestinians or Palestinian Americans. I think like the first main point that I have is that resisting the occupation in general means recognizing Palestinian self-determination, right? And I think like that also means that we as non-Palestinians, in my view, don't really have the authority to say what Palestinians should or shouldn't do. Like part of this whole ideological framework is, respecting that Palestinians are the arbiters of Palestinian resistance. So that's one point. But I also think that that's kind of like the same reason that we as American citizens can and should be having this conversation that we're here to have today, about imposing American political consequences, because, that's where our power and our constituency lies. So I think that, at least within the realm of political consequences, it's really our job as Americans, and specifically doing that as American constituents to push our government towards these policies rather than the responsibility of Palestinians or Palestinian governing organizations. Not to mention that it was, only a few months ago that the United States reopened, diplomatic relations with Palestinians. Yeah, does anybody have anything to add to that?
I can add a little small thing. I'm just worried because my internet is a bit unstable, which I've been informed by Zoom. But I think one thing I would say is one thing the Palestinians can do is host elections. I think that's something that could really boost the credibility of the PA and the PLO. I think it's something that there's a lot of strife in Palestinian civil society about at the moment. Obviously, I'm no expert and I cannot tell the Palestinian government what to do, but I do think amongst their own people and amongst Israelis and the diaspora at large, it would give a better sense of credibility if there was a newly elected government in power in the West Bank. I'm thinking specifically, but also Gaza as well.
Yeah, I think also to sort of generally address the question of how Palestinians in Palestine, particularly in the West Bank, fit into this regime of consequences that we've studied. An area where Palestinian issues have come up in our research is in talking about differentiation policy, particularly as a sort of a subcategory of identifying settlement goods or sort of goods that come from the West Bank versus goods that come from Israel proper. And there's also this issue of differentiating between goods that have been produced by Palestinians, either in Palestinian businesses or businesses operated by Israel, like citizens of Israeli proper and or settlements that employ Palestinians, identifying those goods in which Palestinians have an economic stake versus goods that have been produced entirely by settlers without any collaboration with Palestinians. So as sort of we as J Street U think more carefully about how we might actually articulate these policies on a national level, as these conversations sort of expand a little bit in our larger movement, sort of a live question for us is how to differentiate between activity in the West Bank that harms prospects for peace versus activity in the West Bank that provides certain kinds of like economic, social, political empowerment and agency for Palestinians. And it's really important to us that we sort of impose effective consequences without precluding opportunities for Palestinian success in their own territory, their own society.
Great, and we had a quick follow-up question to that, which is, are we talking about just Palestinians in the West Bank or also in Gaza? And I think we're talking about both Gaza and the West Bank, just to clarify that. While we are talking about Palestinians, we had one other question related to that about how does the right of return hinder the question of Palestinian bargaining?
I'd be happy to take a stab at that one. I mean, so when we talk about the right of return, that's, I think J Street's view is that that's a final status issue that is going to come down to negotiations and peace talks. And certainly it has an effect on how negotiations will turn out and has sometimes derailed them in the past. But when we're talking about consequences, J Street actually views that as outside of the peace process, and that there are Palestinians on the ground now, not Palestinian refugees, but in the West Bank and Gaza right now that are suffering under occupation. And the goal of consequences is hopefully to alleviate some of that suffering in the interim.
Great. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? Okay, great. So we also had a question that I know a lot of us, we've talked about a lot. So the question is J Street willing to broach the subject of conditioning US aid or advocate for it? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. I think it's a good question as well. It's one that we ask ourselves as students in J Street U all the time. I mean, I don't work for J Street. I can tell you that what I know. The one thing I know is that J Street strongly supports, providing the full $3.8 billion of aid to Israel. I don't think J Street wants to get into the territory of talking about what aid should or should not be given to Israel, but rather what Israel can and cannot do with our aid. Because as Israel is a sovereign nation, they can do what they want, but would rather not do things that deepen the occupation or prolong the conflict with money that the United States government and that we as taxpayers give them. So I think the short answer is no to conditional aid. I think that there's also, for me, a pragmatic reason for this, and this is not J Street policy, but I know I presented a slide about sort of the number of representatives that were signing on to certain letters. And I think that if you're someone who thinks about politics through a pragmatic lens, which is how I think about politics, there are certain policies that I would love to see passed, but they just don't have political currency. And I think that when I think about the different kinds of aid restrictions or conditionalities, the one that seems the most powerful to me, maybe right off the bat, is conditional aid, because it's like you're really sticking it to them. But at the end of the day, if it can't pass the House and the Senate, it's pretty ineffective. And I think that's just my personal view. That is devoid from J Street's reasoning. But J Street's reasoning is, the full $3.8 billion should be given to Israel, and they're committed to that. So it's a no to conditional aid, the short answer.
Great, thank you, Tala. So another question we got was, do you have a view on whether the U.S. should take action on Israel's refusal to cooperate with the ICC in view of the fact that U.S. is not signed up to the ICC?
I could try this one out too. So J Street's view is that the ICC has that it does have jurisdiction over the West Bank and Gaza. And J Street applauded the Biden administration removing the Trump administration sanctions on the ICC. And whether that would relate to consequences, I'm not sure J Street has a position on that yet, but certainly we're strong supporters of the ICC being able to conduct its business.
Great, thank you, Jonah. Okay, so we have a question about, so Israel plans to advance a 54-unit extension to the contentious East Jerusalem Jewish neighborhood of Har Hama. Shouldn't that kind of action be included in actions that call for consequences?
Sure, I can take this. I think sort of the short answer is that yes, settlement expansion, especially in sort of areas that are contested under a future peace negotiation, definitely fall under the sort of the broad category of actions that we at J Street U and sort of J Street as the national movement believe hinder prospects for peace and help to entrench the occupation. So we definitely believe that activities such as settlement expansion are things that should be reprimanded using the types of political consequences that we talked about in the session.
Yeah, and just to add on and to kind of point specifically to what we were talking about earlier, this is like a perfect example of a way that restrictive aid would be a useful political consequence to impose, right? We can't control whether they are making these expansions or not as the American government, but we can say, the $3.8 billion of aid that we gave to you this year cannot be used for the necessary purchases to make this expansion. So that's kind of an example how restrictive aid can work in this context.
Great. So we had a follow-up question about how these consequences apply to Gaza.
Yeah, so Gaza is a more difficult question. Certainly the occupation of the West Bank is the focus of many of these consequences, but certainly we could imagine a scenario in which the United States puts aid use restrictions on Israel for actions related to the blockade in Gaza or actions related to what goods they're allowing to come in and out of Gaza. And aid could be, we could say that you can't be using US aid to do that. And of course, I don't think Israel has any immediate plans to annex Gaza, but if they did, certainly J Street would likely call for differentiation between Gaza and Israel proper.
Great, thank you, Jonah. And we had another follow-up question to that question about conditional aid. So why be part of J Street instead of other groups if we're not sure where we fall in relation to conditional aid?
Yeah, I can take that one. As someone who's been part of many different groups to the left of J Street, I think I can speak to this pretty personally. when you want to affect change, in my mind, on an issue, especially an issue that deals with American politics, something that's quite transactional, has a lot to do with lobbying, connections, and power, you really want to find the nexus between your personal politics and where you have the most influence. And I think that there are lots of great ideological groups to our left, that some of their values I really not disagree, I really agree with. And I think they stand up for really great causes. That the issue is, though, when J Street hosts conferences, right, like Nancy Pelosi speaks, or Bernie Sanders comes, or Warren comes, and that's sort of the political currency that I don't really see in any other progressive issue when it comes to Israel-Palestine. And I think that at that stage, when you want to affect the change that you wish to see in the world, there are some trade-offs, at least for me personally, as someone who thinks about this a lot, that you have to make in order to really make the most change. But yeah, if anyone wants to take a stab at that, go for it.
Yeah, I would just say I agree with everything Tala said. I think that like the political capital, and also just like I think J Street stands for a lot of things that I agree with, even if there are some things that I think in every organization you're not going to 100% align with everything that happens. It doesn't look like we have any other questions. So we can give it a minute and see if anyone wants to jump in with anything else.
And one question that lots of people have a lot of the time is, hopefully you're inspired by what we've had to say today. You want to take action, but you're not sure what to do. There are a lot of things you can do. Become a member of J Street, set up a monthly donation at jstreet.org, sign up for J Street's conference on Zoom, which is going to be next Sunday, April 18th, and Monday, April 19th, with lots of amazing speakers, including Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, John Ossoff, Raphael Warnock, many, many, many others. And that's a great way to get involved as well.
Another thing that I'll add is, particularly if you're interested in hearing more about what the Consequences Working Group and what other students within J Street U, which is a college organizing arm, have been up to, following J Street U on our various social media platforms, including Facebook, where this event is being live streamed. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, and we have web presences in other places as well. We as students really value the support and input of members of the organization who are not college students. And we hope that you sort of value the ideas and opinions of people who are on college campuses have to say about these issues. So supporting us and keeping up with us in that way is also a great way to get involved and act on the information.
All right, well, I guess if that, is all the questions that we've been asked. Thank you everybody so much for coming. It's been really great to be able to have the opportunity to have this really important conversation with you all. And, hopefully we'll see you at the national conference next week. Thanks so much and have a good rest of your weekend.